Good morning. I'm Richard Huizar, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Director of Latin American and Latino Studies. Welcome to the Spring 2019 Tinker Lecture. The mission of the Tinker Foundation is to promote the development of an equitable, sustainable, and productive society in Latin America. To continue the mission of the Tinker Foundation, today's lecture is about the role of the United Nations in promoting multilateralism, democracy, and gender equity. I would like to thank the following individuals for making this lecture possible. Her Excellency, Ms. María Fernanda Espinosa Garcés, thank you for accepting our invitation. President Richard Haldobler, former President Kathleen Waldron, Caroline Cronley, President of the Tinker Foundation, Provost Sandra DeYoung, Dean Carl Rabbit, Pam Ferguson, President of the William Patterson Foundation, John Mason, Mark Seddon, Arnold Lewis, and Maureen O'Connor. Last but not least, I would like to thank the faculty from Political Science and Latin American and Latino Studies for always supporting the Tinker Lectures. Now to introduce Her Excellency, please help me welcome Provost Sandra DeYoung.
Thank you, Richard. Welcome, everyone. I'm Interim Provost DeYoung. Excuse me, I'm bringing a welcome from President Richard Haldobler, who couldn't be here today. And I would like to introduce our speaker, Her Excellency, Ms. María Fernanda Espinosa Garcés, who will deliver the Tinker Lecture today. The Tinker Foundation was created by Edward L. Tinker in 1959 in memory of his wife, Frances M. Tinker, his father, Henry Tinker, and his grandfather, Edward Tinker. He was convinced that the future of freedom and prosperity of the peoples of the Americas depended upon their mutual trust, friendship, cooperation, and that it was in that spirit that the foundation was established. The mission of the Tinker Foundation is to promote the development of an equitable, sustainable, and productive society in Latin America. And so it's my honor to introduce our distinguished speaker, Her Excellency, Ms. María Fernanda Espinosa Garcés. On June 5, 2018, the United States General Assembly elected Ecuadorian Foreign Minister María Garcés as president of its 73rd session. Only the fourth woman to hold that position in the history of the world body, and the first since 2006. The president of the 73rd session of the General Assembly, María Fernanda Espinosa Garcés, has more than 20 years of multilateral experience in international organization or negotiations, peace, security, defense, disarmament, human rights, indigenous peoples, gender equality, sustainable development, environment, biodiversity, climate change, and multilateral collaboration. She has served in Ecuador as Minister of Foreign Affairs twice, as Minister of National Defense, and Coordinating Minister of Natural and Cultural Heritage. In those capacities, she coordinated the Sectorial Council on Foreign Policy and Promotion, which includes the Ministries of Tourism, Culture and Heritage, Foreign Trade, and the Environment. Ms. Espinosa Garcés was chair of the Group of 77 and China until January 2018, and also served as the chair of the Andean Community. At the 56th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, she promoted the adoption of the resolution presented by Ecuador entitled Indigenous Women, Key Actors in Poverty and Hunger Eradication. Before beginning her political and diplomatic career, Ms. Espinosa Garcés was associate professor and researcher at the Facultad Latinoamerican de Ciencias Sociales, sede Ecuador. During her time in academia, she received scholarships and grants from the Ford Foundation, the Society of Women Geographers, and the Rockefeller Foundation toward her research on the Amazon. Ms. Espinosa Garcés has written over 30 academic articles about the Amazon region, sustainable development, climate change, and foreign policy. She has studied at Rutgers University. She holds a master's degree in social science and Amazonian studies from the Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales, sede Ecuador, as well as a bachelor's degree in applied linguistics from the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador. So please help me to welcome the President of the United Nations General Assembly, Her Excellency, Ms. María Fernanda Espinosa Garcés.
Well, good morning, everybody. No, good afternoon. No, good morning still. So it's really so great to be back in New Jersey, and I think that I have spent some of my happiest years here when I was studying at Rutgers, and believe me, there are many of us in New York City who'd much rather be on this side of the river. And I'm really very, very happy when we were coming in. It looked so much like New Brunswick and the areas where I spent, full 3 years of my life. So I think that it's truly a pleasure to deliver the Spring 2019 Tinker Lecture, and I would like to acknowledge a few people before I begin. Dr. Richard Held-Dobler, President, he couldn't make it, he's not among us, but of course my acknowledgement and respects to him. President of this university, Kathleen Waldrom, former president of the university, Sandra de Jong, acting provost and senior vice president for academic affairs, Caroline Cronley, president of the Tinker Foundation, among us also, Dr. Cara Rabbit, dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and finally Professor John Mason and Professor Richard Huizard, for all their support in putting together this event. Thank you all for being here. Truly, I was always going to accept this invitation to speak, but I was twice as keen to do so, knowing that this event is jointly organized by the Political Science Department and the Latin America and Latino Studies program. I understand, and that makes me very, very happy, that over 30% of students here have Hispanic heritage. You may know that I am the first Latina elected to serve as president of UN General Assembly, and I am very proud of that. As an Ecuadorian woman, as a Latin American woman, it is an honor and a privilege to serve as the president from the biggest and most representative UN body, the UN General Assembly. So I think that today is very important to me in terms of engaging future generations of diplomats and UN officials, Latina, Latino, and otherwise. I think it's extremely important, muy importante para mí estar aquí. Y si pudiera hablar en español sería mucho mejor, pero sé que tengo que hablar en inglés, así es que con mucho gusto voy a hacer ese esfuerzo. And I have to say that wherever I go, I meet with students and young people. Today's generation of young people is the largest in the history of the world in terms of numbers, but also in terms of qualification, commitment, skills, knowledge. And I think that between now and 2030, the deadline for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, which I will say more about it later, half of the global population will be under 30. And that's a really an opportunity, but also a huge challenge. And this, of course, poses some challenges, to be sure. We need to create 40 million jobs each year until 2030. We need 600 million new jobs until 2030. The majority of these jobs, of course, are for the younger generations. And that's without counting the 60 million young people who are currently unemployed. But this youth generation, as mentioned, is also a great opportunity. As Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defense in Ecuador, and now as President of the General Assembly, I have seen firsthand the promise that young people offer, from junior diplomats who've made breakthroughs in negotiations to young inventors working on ways to clean up our oceans, for example. I have read a bit about some of your students too here, like Shaddai Williams, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, who received a Newman Civic Fellow Award this year for working with the elderly, addressing food insecurity and much more. So that speaks well about this place, about this university, but about younger generations as well. So as mentioned, your generation is highly educated and creative. You are willing to take risks and challenge received wisdom. And you don't need to be told that multilateralism matters. You already know that the problems we face, like climate change, violent extremism, international migration, cannot be solved by one government, or indeed by governments acting alone. From Jersey to Jakarta to Johannesburg, young people get multilateralism and what it is about, which is why one of my priorities as President of the General Assembly has been to ensure that young people are involved in our work. Let me turn now to the reason why we so desperately need the input of the younger generation. I will start by giving you a little bit of a background on the United Nations before moving on to the current context of our work and how it is affecting some of the issues I work on day in, day out, such as gender equality and migration. The UN's founding story involves countries coming together in the aftermath of World War II and aspiring to work together for peace, development, and human rights. But the UN was not just an idealistic endeavor. It was a pragmatic response by hard-nosed world leaders who weighed the downsides of compromise against the benefits of cooperation and the heavy cost of war and violence. The UN was never intended to be a world government, whatever its critics might say. It is not even close to that. It is indeed an intergovernmental organization with 193 member states. And in case you're wondering what exactly does the President of the General Assembly, well, I will tell you a little bit of that, my work, the job I have. Well, the president is elected each year by the UN's member states to guide the organization's work. So I am a voted official, but by the 193 states. I preside over the General Assembly, the closest thing we have to something that I call the Parliament of Humanity, which agrees on the UN agenda, its budget, its priorities, its policy priorities as well. It is the General Assembly, it is a norm and policy-making body in all fields of development, human rights, and peace and security. I make sure that all the main bodies of the UN are working together in support of our objectives. I support negotiation processes between states, and there are now over 50 at present on everything from universal health coverage to financing for development, climate change, and the very reform of the United Nations system, and including, of course, the reform of the Security Council. And when states come together, the results can be fantastic. Let me give you a few examples from Latin America and the Caribbean precisely. The UN has supported peace in countries such as Colombia. It helped demobilize warring parties in El Salvador. It helped the region reduce hunger and infant mortality by over 60% between 1990 and 2015. Right now, it is supporting flood victims in Peru and child vaccinations in the Dominican Republic. It is helping small island states to build their resilience against natural disasters and climate change impact. All of this might seem very far away from us here, perhaps, but the UN makes a difference to our lives too, through international agreements on issues such as equal pay for men and women. You know that worldwide there is still a 20% gap between same jobs, same background, same talent and capacity, 20% less that women get just because they are women. So we are also fighting and working strongly for the economic empowerment of women and equal pay. So that's one of the things, but air pollution, healthy oceans, climate, all of that is part of our agenda. I am sure that you will have heard of the Paris Agreement on climate change and also the Sustainable Development Goals, two agreements that have the potential to transform our world and also save humanity. I say that the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are a survival kit that we have agreed upon, the 193 states. Now it is time to implement, and of course there are serious challenges to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are interesting parts of the UN that you may not have heard of, like the International Civil Aviation Organization, which looks after things like flight safety. Or the Office for Outer Space Affairs, which helps to ensure you have mobile data on your phones. This is part of the work we also do and is unknown to the majority of the people out there and of public opinion. That is just a snapshot of the UN's achievements and the range of issues it works on. And it does so on a modest budget, and I have to say, on a very modest budget. The total spending by all parts of the UN, peace operations, development agencies, humanitarian programs, health, and so on, is about $50 billion a year. Now that sounds like a huge amount, of course, $50 billion, it's like a big amount. But let's put this amount into context. The world's richest man has a net worth of 3 times that amount. One person. So New York City's budget is nearly twice as big as the overall United Nations. Americans spend roughly the same amount on pizza each year. So it's not that much, is it? And these are true figures. It's not. I'm not making them up. So you know. So we know, of course, that there are plenty of times when the UN has failed, of course. And we have to acknowledge that. Last week, we commemorated the 25th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, one of the worst examples ever. More than 1 million people were killed because of their ethnicity. And it only happened 25 years ago. And despite the great progress we have made, millions of people around the world continue to endure violence, war, and deprivation. Billions of people do not have access to safe water or sanitation. They continue to die from preventable diseases. Uncertainty and fear are a daily reality for these people. And the gains we have made over the past 70 years are now at risk, as a number of crises, environmental, political, economic, and social, are driving conflict and instability around the world. Climate change is jeopardizing sustainable development and peace, threatening the lives and livelihoods of billions of people around the world. The world's growing population expected to reach 11.2 billion by 2100. And this will lead to even greater demand for natural and social resources, adding further pressures to our economies and to our ecosystems. Every analysis based on sound evidence shows that these challenges will not be addressed if we don't work together. No single country or region, as I already mentioned, can address climate change alone. No one is immune to international terrorism or pandemics. We need global cooperation more than ever. Global cooperation has a synonym, which is multilateralism. And the main home for multilateralism is precisely the United Nations. But at a time when the case for multilateralism should be obvious, we are witnessing a rise in nationalist sentiment. We live in an era of transformation from the impacts of automation and digitization on the economy to the effects of globalization and social attitudes and expectations. Many people around the world are feeling insecure and ill-served by their political leaders, and it is happening worldwide. Neither the UN nor traditional political establishments have yet managed to address this anxiety in a meaningful way. People are scared of not having jobs, of not having a promising future for themselves and for their families, of not having health care, or of not living in safe environments. And this is happening worldwide, here and elsewhere, wherever you look, east and west, north and south. And this has opened up opportunities for those who seek to attribute people's struggles to multilateral institutions, the so-called global elites, or to immigrants. So who is to blame? Inaction of the United Nations or immigrants sometimes. And we have heard that a lot and more in different parts of the world. They promise easy solutions that stand no chance of addressing the challenges we face. They peddle an insular vision of nationalism to score political points with domestic constituencies. They point to some unspecified time in the past when things were supposedly better. Except, of course, they weren't better for the poor, for women, for minorities, for persons with disabilities. They weren't better times. This narrative has created a difficult environment at the UN on many issues. And I have to be very honest and straightforward with you. We see it, and I see it, perhaps most obviously in disagreements in the Security Council every day, when they cannot agree on issues such as Yemen, such as Syria, such as Libya, the Middle East, and other very red zones when we're talking about violence, conflict, and the suffering of civilians. But there has also been a backlash, for example, against women's rights, with long-standing principles on areas such as sexual and reproductive health being challenged, strongly challenged. Even at the UN, the expression gender. There was a country that requested the references to gender to be deleted from UN documents. So we are living very, very challenging times at the UN. Last year, when I was helping member states with the global compacts on refugees and on migration, I was shocked at nasty smear campaign about what these agreements would mean in practice. They're not legally binding, they're frameworks, reference frameworks to improve our policy choices and to encourage cooperation between countries of origin, transit, and destination of migration, and to establish, basic rights and dignity for refugees. They are just reference frameworks, but we lost the communication battle with these two global compacts, and we have to also acknowledge that and look critically at the role of social media sometimes. Social media can be extremely helpful, can be the space for debate, dialogue, and knowledge. They can have a very positive impact, but they can also be used, for fake news and for really altering the truth, such as, what happened to us with the Global Compact on migration. But we were able to adopt the compact, to have a very strong conference on migration in Marrakesh, to bring back the compact, both compacts, to New York and adopt them in December last year. It was, I have to say, astounding, really, because if you're worried about immigration, surely you should be in favor of a managed approach to regular and safe migration. That's what the Global Compact is about. And if you are worried about refugees coming to your shores, although I must point out that over 85% of the world's refugees are hosted by developing countries, surely you should be in favor of international programs that address the reasons why people flee their homes. These were the purposes, of course. And we have to remind ourselves that 85% of the refugees around the world are hosted by developing countries. And I come from a country that has open arms and a lot of generosity, receiving internally displaced persons and refugees from Colombia for the past 40 years. And, we have had a very strong affirmative action policies for the respect and social inclusion of Colombian refugees in Ecuador for a long time. We still have 200,000 requests for refuge from Colombian citizens in Ecuador. These trends are playing out in communities and in countries. We see in the rise of extreme nationalists in every region. We see it in the challenges to regional cooperation in Europe, for instance, but also in Latin America. I recently visited Argentina, Cuba, and Mexico, and took part in a conference on South-South cooperation. And it is not an easy time for the region, I have to tell you. So what can we do? What can we do, us, you, the UN, the younger generations, young professionals, the Latino community here in the US? Well, the best way to convince people that multilateralism works is to show them that it works for them, to connect our work to the people we represent, to public opinion, to bring the UN closer to the people and the people closer to the UN. That's also part of my presence here among you. Part of this means doing a better job in communicating the work of the UN. We have a lot of good stories to tell and a lot of talented people working on the ground, but we aren't doing a good job of making the case for the UN. But it also means doing more to make the UN relevant to all people, as I just mentioned. Every year, the General Assembly has to choose a theme. The theme I chose for this year is making the UN relevant to all. And we are working very strongly to make sure that it does happen. We collectively build United Nations that is relevant to the people we serve, especially the disenfranchised, the vulnerable, the poor, the hungry. More than any speech or public relations campaign, we need to show people that the UN can deliver, including for those who feel marginalized. In 2015, world leaders came together and adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, which is something like a global Green New Deal. With targets on education, on decent work, on social protection, on environmental sustainability, tackling corruption, things that will make a tangible difference to people's lives. And the goals are not an aid program, rich countries helping the poor. That does not work. That's not what the purpose is. This is a universal agenda, which recognizes that all governments must do more for their citizens and for the world. We need to encourage politicians, cities, communities, companies, schools, universities to get behind the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. And this is where you come in. As students, as professionals. I said earlier that I hope there are future diplomats and UN officials among you. but you don't have to work for your government or at the UN to make the difference, and that's for sure. You have tremendous power as citizens. Governments are more likely to support international cooperation and initiatives like the SDGs if they think their voters care, and you are well informed about the power of multilateralism and the role of the United Nations. You also have the power as consumers. One of my priorities is precisely fighting plastic pollution. We have already seen the progress that has been made in relation to plastic bags and straws, for example, but we continue to struggle. And here, perhaps, a little secret, but I am continuing my fight to have the UN, become a single plastic-free environment. We haven't succeeded yet at the UN. So we have still a lot of work to do. Single-use plastic bottles, straws, you know that between 8 and 12 million tons of plastics go to the ocean every year. And that is on us. These are also our consumer choices. We also have power as activists in your communities and online. I know it can feel like you're standing in the street and nobody is listening, or that you are marching with thousands and then nothing happens. But it does have an impact. It does have an impact. Everybody at the UN has been talking about the youth climate strikes, for example. And you can push us to do more and to do better as citizens, as activists, as consumers. And whatever path you choose, lawmaker, lawyer, entrepreneur, translator, teacher, parent, you can contribute to a safer, fair, and more sustainable world, to an atmosphere where the dignity and worth of every human being is respected. If you only remember one thing from this lecture, and I hope this is it. Dignity and worth of every human being is respected. And I hope I have encouraged you to learn more about the United Nations and to get involved in our work, and we are counting on you. So thank you. Thank you very much for listening and for your patience. So I don't know the format, but are there questions? I would love to have a dialogue with, I don't know if I'm supposed to do this or not, but...
We have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand. And we're going to begin with our journalism students.
Hi, how are you? My name is Priscilla Ziskin. I'm a little nervous. Thank you for everything you've done so far. My first question for you is, do you believe in the glass ceiling effect, and do you think it has affected you while being voted in as president?
Yeah, shall we, gather a few questions, or do you want me to respond one on one? I don't mind, but I will respond to your question. The issue of the glass ceiling, the participation of women in all spheres of society is extremely important. If you look at the numbers, we're not doing that well, because if you look at women presidents, heads of state and government, only 20 out of 193. If you look at parliaments, 70% of parliamentarians are men. Only 25% are women. If we look at the salary gap between men and women, I already mentioned the 20% gap. If you look, wherever you look, if you look at the private sector, it's embarrassing. Less than 4% of CEOs of the 500 more powerful companies are women. 4%. So we're not doing that well. So I think we need to continue struggling. I organized a few weeks ago at the UN for the first time. I invited all female presidents, heads of state and government, but with one purpose. First of all, to hear firsthand from their battles, to break the glass ceiling, but on the other hand, to ask them to mentor the younger generations. So we also invited younger leaders, female leaders, to have this conversation. And I think that parity and women empowerment and women participation in politics, it's not about optics, it's not about aesthetics, it's about quality of democracy, it's about bringing our voice, it is about value added to the things we do. And it's been proven. Let me give you yet another example. On the peace and security field, we have 100,000 peacekeepers at the UN. We are working in 14 countries in peacekeeping operations. Less than 4% are female in our peacekeeping forces. And it has been proven that when women participate in peacekeeping, but also in mediation and peace negotiations, solutions come sooner and last more. And this is it's hard numbers. And so we really need to continue working. Of course, we have made progress. But we still need to do more. And when you look at me, I am only the fourth female in 73 years of history of the United Nations. It means that we're not doing well yet. And I'm the first Latin American and Caribbean woman. So there is a lot to do still, but we rely very much on your leadership, on your commitment, on your, bold and strong messages, because we do bring quality and we make the difference. And we are 50% of the world population as well.
Thank you very much. Can I ask one more question?
Who's next?
Do you want me to ask your question?
Go ahead, Zach. You're next.
Hi, my name is Zachary Thomas. So my question is, the current political and social climate in Venezuela is pretty bad. Do you think there is a solution that can be found within the United Nations? And what role does domestic jurisdiction laid out in Article 2, Section 7, what role does that play in dealing with the actual solution?
Well, yes, indeed. The situation in Venezuela is very complicated. It is so complex that there is no agreement within the United Nations on what to do regarding Venezuela. It's a very divisive issue, a very polarized discussion going on at the UN. Perhaps you have followed, but the Security Council has had 3 or 4 special meetings on Venezuela. Several resolutions with the exercise of the veto power from one side and the other. But what I can tell you is that we have to be loyal to the UN Charter and to the UN principles, which is peaceful means, which is dialogue, which is negotiation. And as a UN elected member, as the voice of 193 states, I can tell you that the only way that we can see, to address the Venezuelan situation is through dialogue, through negotiation that should involve all parties. And at the end of the day, the Venezuelans have to take, the decisions. Of course, international community can support our executive. The Secretary General has offered his good offices to support, encourage, and mediate a potential negotiation in Venezuela. And we do care very much about the people suffering in Venezuela. There is a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, and the UN is doing its share. We are deploying our humanitarian capacity, and now we are working with International Red Cross to ensure that people at least can receive the basics to survive, medicines and food. But also I have to say, quite honestly, is that the sanctions against Venezuela are not helping, because they're not able to get, what they need to address the pressing needs of innocent civilians at the end of the day.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. Well, my question for you today is, you expressed the importance of the youth generation to, get involved. Can you expand on maybe the path that they can get to the UN, maybe contact, work with you guys? Do you have internships or opportunities for young students?
Sure, I think it's a great question. I mean, it has two sides. One is the professional opportunities in the UN, and there's a whole program of internships, encouragement for young professionals, and of course, my team will be more than happy to provide you with more specific information. I do in my cabinet. My cabinet is of about 40 people, but I am very lucky because I work every day with the support of interns, of young professionals that come and work to support us. But the UN as such, as an organization, we do have an internship program. The second part is how to involve young generations in decision making at the UN, which I think is extremely important. And we are really making huge progress. I was the ambassador of my country at the UN 10 years ago. And I rarely saw young activists and young leaders in the rooms, in the corridors of power of the UN. It wasn't, it didn't happen often. But now, well, first of all, the Secretary General has appointed an envoy on youth. She's doing an extraordinary job to bring, young people in everything we do at the UN. There is a youth strategy, the Youth 2030 strategy that connects to the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is built in the system now, the envoy on youth. But on the other hand, everything I do as president of the General Assembly, I make sure that we listen to youth voices. 2 weeks ago, I organized a high-level event with heads of state and government, with ministers on climate change. But we brought in young leaders working on climate change from around the world. How many? 80, 60? 60, I think, youth delegates, but not to have them sit and listen. They were part of the conversation, and they were interacting with heads of state and government, with ministers, and put forward their agendas on climate. I'm also working, one of my priorities this year is youth, peace and security, because what is happening is that when you see the number of young people unemployed, especially in some regions of the world, and I have to be very careful to single out regions, but basically the easy equation is to say, when young people don't have jobs, when they don't see a future for themselves, what they do is they get into violent extremism or terrorism. So a young person now becomes a threat to society, and this is completely wrong. I mean, we really need to change the perception and the narrative. And what we are doing is to look at the role of young people as peace builders and peacemakers. And we are working on that. That is very much part of my agenda. Last week, we organized a discussion, a conversation on the role of youth in peace and security. Whatever we do, again, we commemorated the 100th anniversary of the International Labour Organization last week. And, the main players of the conversation, together with ministers of labor, were young representatives having a conversation about the future of work and how much, they deserve to have decent jobs for their professional future. That was part of the conversation. So I think that there is a paradigm shift in the voices of the younger generations in our work.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming again. Along with the conversation of young influence, do you think social media as a platform influences the youth with involving in social, political, and economic issues around the world?
I have. This is recorded, isn't it? Okay, so I will try to. Okay, so I have to say that I have mixed feelings regarding social media, because social media can have such a transformative power in terms of quick access to information, awareness building. It's a very powerful education tool. We are using more and more, and this is really speeding up the pace in which we can be well informed on issues. So it has a lot of potential. It is very powerful. But the other side of the coin is that if we don't use social media properly, this can have really very, very adverse effects in many things. Let me give you an example, very sad example, but what happened recently in Christchurch in New Zealand. It was a live video of a person killing, almost 100 innocent Muslims when they were praying. And that was live, and with messages that were, not only Islamophobic, but xenophobic, embedded, the best example of hate speech. And this is really harming society, our values, the need for a peaceful and respectful and tolerant coexistence. Because our world, the main wealth we have is not Wall Street and the bonds and the capital markets. The wealth we have is our cultural diversity and what we bring to humanity as diverse people and cultures and epistemologies. I mean, that's the wealth of our planet. So, it can have very dangerous effects. What happened with the Global Compact on Migration to us, to the UN? We have a big communication apparatus, and when we realized that it was a very well-organized campaign, anti-migrant campaign worldwide, very well organized, very well orchestrated. We kind of lost the battle. We reacted, but it was a little bit too late. And when, in spite of that, we were able to adopt the compact and to vote for the compact at the General Assembly. So I think that at some point, and I'm a big supporter of freedom of speech, but at some point I think that we need to come to grips with better governance for social media. And I'm going to be quoted on that one. But okay, what can we do?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm a student here. My question was, you mentioned that the UN has a budget of $50 billion. Is there any way, perhaps, that the UN can have the power of taxation, or is there like something that us young people can do, maybe fundraise or like other things, so that the UN can get the money it needs in order to actually do more intergovernmental programs, such as cleaning up the plastic that you mentioned, as well as finding safe places for the refugees that are going to come because of the climate inactivity that we have in our developed nations?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And most of the programs and agencies at the UN, we have, a very good example, UNICEF. UNICEF lives very much out of, private contributions. They have very good campaigning. They're one of the best at the UN. We're not very good in communicating in general at the UN, but they do a very good campaign. And for example, our fight against HIV/AIDS has benefited from philanthropy and world philanthropy as well. So there are mechanisms and ways. But at the same time, time, I think that it is very important that who runs the house, which are the member states, at least they pay their dues. We have, unfortunately, member states that have arrears that are really causing, financial stress in the organization, to put it mildly. So I think it's very important that all member states, they do what they need to do, they pay their dues, but of course there are some initiatives that run with public-private partnerships, some our vaccination initiatives, the organization of Bill Gates, what is the Gates Foundation. I mean, we are working together, but as regular citizens, you can, of course, support and do things for the UN. We have a lot of campaigns going on. One of them is the plastics campaign with the support of UN Environment, which is a specialized agency of the UN. And I am with you. I mean, one of the most, the deepest existential threats to humanity is climate change. And we're putting a lot of weight on that, and we're very encouraged to see this country, for example. You might see what is she saying? But yes, indeed, we're very encouraged because we see that hundreds of cities in the United States, individual states of the United States, such as California, are taking very seriously the Paris Agreement and the mitigation commitments.
One last question, is that correct? Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Marina. I have a question for you. You were mentioning the underage unemployment rate across the world. What about a situation like Gaza and Palestine, where you have them in a blockade and the majority of the people there are under 30 and they're all unemployed? What do you do for that? Like, what can the UN help with that?
Well, I think it's a very good question, because in the case of Palestine, there are so many factors that are combined. And the way I say, and that's one of the very few things where I have a very strong stand, even if there's no unanimity within the UN. But I would say almost unanimity, that I always say that the Palestinian issue is the open wound of the multilateral system. We have passed, I don't know how many resolutions looking at every area of the Palestinian situation, the health rights of the Palestinian people, the issue of violence against women, against Palestinian women, children not going to schools, so that is a more structural, deeply rooted situation, which of course you have some symptoms that are very unhappy symptoms, such as youth unemployment, but that also comes with the restrictions of young generations of Palestinians not being able to go to school, not even to think about university and develop professional skills because of the particular situation of the Palestinian people. And we need to do more and better there. And I'm a strong advocate to say the only thing we have to do is implement the UN resolutions, both from the Security Council and the General Assembly on Palestine.
Excuse me, what about the growing threat of nuclear war? You haven't mentioned it.
True. Sorry, I'm going to respond to that. I think, yes, indeed, it is a reality. It is a real threat. In terms of the work of the UN, we have two key international instruments. One is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is, I would say, very complex, because we haven't been able to deliver, member states haven't been able to deliver to the NPT. But we also have newly created instruments, which is the Spanish comes to me here. It's the International Treaty for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. Am I right? which is not enforced yet because it doesn't have the number of signatures and ratifications that are needed. International Treaty for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. I think that, I don't know if I passed that exam, but we can double check on the web. So we do have the elements, we do have the instruments, we need the political will. We need, especially the nuclear states to come to grips on that. There are, interesting developments. For example, the progress in the conversations for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So that is, quote unquote good news, but this is part of our list of things to do at the UN. But for that, we have to stop using nuclear power as a deterrence mechanism. So it is a true risk, and it can really just erase humanity from the face of the earth, as simple as that.
Excellency is on a very tight schedule today, so I'm sorry to cut off what is a very fruitful question and answer period, but I wanted to give you a small thank you and above all, a token of our gratitude for your coming to William-Patterson University.
Thank you so much. And perhaps if you allow me just one sentence, just for the ones that have Latino origins. I have noticed, and I am Ecuadorian, we have hundreds and thousands of Ecuadorians in this part of the United States, that second generations of Ecuadorians of my own country, they don't speak Spanish anymore. So please do speak Spanish, do use Spanish. It is so important. There are more Spanish speakers in the world than English speakers. It is extremely important that we reflect our cultural diversity powerfully using our own language. And here I am speaking in English, but tell me, my second language is French. And when I came to Rutgers to study my doctorate, PhD, my English was like at 2%. So I learned English when I was a grown-up, and I think it also shows. But I think that just a message, just be very proud of your origin and of your language. Y hablemos español lo más que podamos. Muchas gracias.